Hi, I'm John Atack, and I'm extremely pleased to have Karen de la Carrière here. This is the first time we've met before, which was great, but I've not interviewed you before, so I'm really thrilled to be seeing you.
Thank you, John. Thank you. We met in London, was it 4 years ago?
I think it was
We
about
actually had lunch at that big conference table with a lot of people.
yeah.
The amazing author of, what's the book?
Russell
Miller was with us. Yeah.
I worked with Russell throughout Barefaced Messiah as his researcher, and my Let's Sell These People a Blue Sky was the foundation upon which he built, because I couldn't find a publisher. So after he was published, I then managed to get into print. But he is one of the world's most celebrated biographers. His biography of Conan Doyle, for example, or Hugh Hefner, or Getty, or so Ron Hubbard was one of the series, and it's a great book. It still stands, I think.
So A Piece of Blue Sky has had a life of its own. When I picked it up, I literally stayed up 2 o'clock. I mean, it's a nice, easy read, but I could not put it down. It was riveting.
Oh, thank you.
I think we should, I'll be promoting this show to at least 22 Facebook groups, all of X, and I'm going to, is it available on Amazon?
Yeah, we reissued it because when it was first published, we had to paraphrase 60 of Hubbard's most private statements, his harassment orders, his journals, and his letters, because of a strange situation in American law. In 2018, we brought out the unexpurgated version, which has all 60 of those quotations back and about 40 more for good measure. But so yeah, it's called Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky now. There is still a pirate edition that's called A Piece of Blue Sky, but that's the original book, and I want nothing to do with the people who are trying to steal it from me.
Yeah, I heard you didn't get any royalties.
I got some. I got some, but it went bestseller. It went number 98 out of 4 million books at Amazon, and I didn't get anything from that period.
Jeez. And well, you were the godfather. There have been books and books and books, but you stuck your neck out in the early days, right? That was very brave of you.
Oh, thank you.
Very brave.
That means this week I've been called the original gangster on Leah Remini's show and the godfather. What does this tell us?
Yeah, but you were brave, John. You were brave.
I never really thought about it. I think Leah asked me in the podcast they've just put up on Fair Game why I did it, and in the end I just had to say I'm pig-headed. That's it, you know. And it took me ages after I left, because I was 9 years in. I did OT5. I was a class 2 auditor, did the data series evaluators course, Dianetic auditor, method 1 auditor, all that stuff. Totally believed in it, absolutely, through that time, never on staff. And when I left, it was like, well, this is wrong and they've done the wrong things. And of course, somebody has to stand up and say this. And I had no idea what the Guardian's office were going to do in response. And I couldn't understand why all of these people I was talking to were so scared. These people who'd done these OT levels and, you know, been commanding officers of various organizations. And they were, oh, no, not going to say anything. And I just didn't understand it. And at first I thought, well, it's because they know what the Guardian's office will do and you'll be harassed. But then I came to something else. And this was quite some time afterwards. I heard this expression, total convert. And I realized that because I was never on staff, I was never abused or humiliated. And I also realized that of the 1,000 or so Scientologists I've talked to, I can't think of anyone else that's true for. Everybody else I know was crush-regged into, you know, selling something they didn't have, borrowing money, or they were treated as a slave in the Sea organization, or, you know, when I came to, I helped put together the Leahy case in 1984, the famous child custody case in England. And I happened to know Jay Hurwitz. And so I said to the couple who were doing it, oh, Jay will come and testify, because he had been the business partner of the father of the children, David Banks, who I think I can name now without anything happening too badly. And David Banks, and I don't think this has ever been publicly said, he'd said in sworn statements to the court that he thought disconnection was a dreadful thing. You know, he didn't agree with this. And Jay came along and gave me a letter that David Banks had written saying that they could put a partition up the staircase and through the office so they'd never have to actually see each other. This is how much he didn't believe in disconnection. But when I told the stepfather of the kids, Jay Hurwitz will come along, he blanched. He was scared. And I was sort of, what's going on? He said, I work for Jay. And the last time I saw him, he pushed me up against the wall and threatened to punch me, you know. And those kind of pressures, this never happened to me. So I was foolish enough to be able to speak out against it. And after that, it was, I think Jeffrey has the same thing that I have. You've just got to know the answer. You've started asking these questions. What was Hubbard really doing? What was this all about? You know, and I went on till 96, then I left, then I came back in 2013 and started writing for Tony Ortega's Bunker, because I realized that most people don't really escape, that the way of thinking is so overwhelming that even though they've got rid of, you know, they're not talking about the overt motivator sequence anymore. Now they're talking about karma. And if they've read anything about it, they're talking about karma vipaka, but we won't get into that. But they're still thinking. This is still the way the universe is. And of course it isn't. L. Ron Hubbard's perception of the universe was the perception of a narcissist, you know, and it was all about him trying to desperately cure all of these things that were wrong with him, which he lists in great detail in Dianetics, the Modern Science of Mental Health: asthma, short-sightedness, bursitis. I'd never heard of bursitis before, but he had it in the right shoulder. You know, there's a bursa between the muscle and the bone, and it wasn't working properly, and it never did. And of course, he never stopped being short-sighted. He never overcame his asthma. But I think he was also trying to deal with his own desperate psychiatric condition. Yeah. And we just got, you know, we became part of that solipsistic mess that was the ego of L. Ron Hubbard. But I'm not here to
No, I love it. I love when you're on a roll. I prefer interviews that go like this, and it gets an energy going. I want to say two things. Yeah. One is, there are people like you in Scientology slang, kick-ass Satan. Kick-ass means you kick ass, or arse, as they say in England.
That sounds right when you say that. It does it.
But why do you do that? I'll tell you why. What is really important, I'm being evaluative. I can evaluate.
And now, yeah, loud.
You pursue truth and you like to uncover lies. I'm dialed into you and I really read you. What is important to you? What is wanted within your soul is to just disintegrate fake falsehoods. And that's probably why the book, I Want to Sell You a Piece of Blue Sky, came forth, because you saw lies. And I think it's so important in your heart to reveal truth. Not only truth, actual knowledge, wisdom, fact. Did I read you well there? I got to tell you, somebody posted your SB Declare on Outer Banks. Was it Outer Banks or Exander? And it was a hoot to read. Not only in those days, they were more daring with their SB as a person, but they said, if you connect with John, if you are friendly with him, you too will get. Do you know they put that in your SB Declare? That just connect. Well, you must have seen it, right?
It's been a while.
It's been a while. What a hoot. It was just laughable. They don't even send you your SB Declare.
Oh, no.
It's hidden in HCO and under lock and key.
Yeah.
So your an uncoverer of lies. What I really dialed into you, John, if you get an opportunity, that's why you interview people like me. You want to continue to unpeel and undress and unveil the packages of lies. And there are a lot of lies in Scientology, a lot of lies. May I respond to you on one nice issue you brought up, which is why people cling on and are so indoctrinated? I want to give you, I want to toss it. Actually, I want your response to my response.
Of course, yeah.
It has been said that people will suffer a humongous amount of pain for a little piece of pleasure. And what I want to tell you is, in very early Scientology, you can get a win. A win. It's not sustainable, doesn't last. You can crash and burn next week. But in that little win, people get hooked and they want to replicate that win. So if they go into debt for $100,000 to have 3 L's, whose results are temporary, not sustainable, and they crash and burn and they divorce their wife 6 months later and they go bankrupt, but they're hooked up on the win. They want that few moments of win. Can you say something? Can you respond to that?
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. That it's what Abraham Maslow, the psychologist, called a peak experience. And if you talk, I've talked with people who, for example, took LSD when that was a popular thing to do, and they had a peak experience and they wanted to repeat that. They wanted to do that again.
Yes.
Worse yet, if they took cocaine, that they can become addicted to it. And I started quite soon after I left looking at Scientology as a process of addiction, that you have, very good indicators, VGIs, this idea of euphoria, that you become, you feel fantastic. Well, that feeling, as you say, you want to repeat that, you want to get to it again. What I found when I first left, almost everybody I talked to, and I talked to hundreds of people, I'd say, what was the first win? What was the first peak experience? When did you have it? It'd usually be on training routines, very often on training routines.
Yes.
And I knew about that because I'd studied Zen meditation before Scientology. So I know if you fix your attention, you get what's called the Ganzfeld effect. You will start to have distortions of perception, and then your brain will start to fill in hallucinations. You'll start to see things, but you'll also start getting a feeling of euphoria. So I knew all about that. I'd been doing, before I got to Scientology. The other place where people would very often have a win would be in a book 1 session or in an early auditing session. And the same was true for me. For me, it was a self-analysis session I had, where you just feel fantastic. And you think that feeling fantastic belongs to the process or procedure, whereas in fact, it belongs to you. It's your feeling. And
right on.
You're hooked,
You can go to a casino and you can win $500,000 one night. And boy, the casino laughs at you because you'll be back. And every dollar of that $500,000 will be given back, because the euphoria you feel on the win of getting $500,000 for no work at all, you just want to repeat that. You believe you are invincible enough to recreate that. So you give it right back. So there's this involuntary replication when you were saying how people just keep believing, even when their family is destroyed, they're disconnected, they're broke because they've given every last dime, taken out a second mortgage on their home, and they still want to be loyal to Hubbard. it's this euphoria that they cannot forget. And they believe that continuing, no matter what hardship, will replicate that euphoric happiness. They yearn for it.
Yeah.
And I know that because the arguments I get when people, I'm friendly with a lot of people who are still half in, half out. And, you know, they debate me and they reprimand me for my video channel and think it's not fair that I say bad things about Hubbard and that we get into discussion. No matter what hardship, no matter what penalty. I was talking to an OT8 who has incredible body problems. Just his body is falling apart. And I said to him, but Dianetics says you won't even get a common cold after Dianetics. And look at you, OT8, you've given them $1 million. I'm in better health than you. I run 3 miles a day at my age. And you auditing your BTs and your entities every day. Look at you. Can't get him to see. He fervently believes. And that's because he says, Karen, haven't you had wins? He keeps harping on the fact that you have that peak that you talked about. So to try and understand the mind of a dedicated loyal Scientologist is, although people do reach a threshold, don't you agree? And then they depart. Everybody will take that much.
Yeah, and it's a matter of peeling the onion and taking the layers off until they get there. I mean, with most of us, the process was that the organization was too harsh. That was where it starts for most people, that the organization is just nasty. When I, in 1982, saw the name David Miscavige for the first time, it was in a newsletter that had been published with a picture of him poking a finger at somebody. And underneath it said that he was going to be tough and ruthless. And that was it for me. Tough, I didn't mind. Ruthless, without mercy.
Yeah.
No, where does, that's not, compassion is a significant aspect of life. But you use the word fervent, and I think that really homes in on it. You've met my very good friend and colleague Yuval Laor, who has spent the last 25 years developing an analysis of how people become drawn into groups. And he's made all sorts of interesting distinctions. One of them is that some people are high fervor, some people are low fervor. That doesn't mean that they won't stick to the thing. It just means they won't make as much noise about it. People have an experience of awe or wonder. Something happens which is inexplicable to them. And they then believe that the source of that is to be believed about everything. So yes, there is that plain contradiction. If you say, I remember the first time I met Jerry Armstrong back in 1984, and that 3 burly ex-Sea organization people there were going, you're working for the CIA, and you could see that they meant him harm, and there's Jerry sitting there not noticing anything of it and just having a discussion. He said, show me a clear. Show me anybody that's achieved. Now, of course, I got into the deep history of this. Hubbard claims to have, I think, 270 cases. By the time he writes Dianetics, he says he's cleared 270 people. Now, what happened to those people? Not one of them has ever come forward. What we do know is that among those people, the people he'd treated, many of them complained about what had happened. So Dr. Joseph Winter, who'd worked with him on the book, when Art Sepos, who published the book for the medical publisher Hermitage House, decided it was a fraud, it was published by the October, the publisher said, I'm withdrawing it. It's a fraud. And he commissions Dr. Joe Winter to write a book that says there might be some value in Dianetics, but Hubbard is a con man. And Yeah, I interviewed by mail. I interviewed Don Rogers, who wrote the appendix to the original Dianetics, which stayed in the book until the 1980s. And Don was on the board of every foundation until 1954, and there were several of them. And he still really liked Hubbard. 30 years later, he's writing me, he's got nothing against Hubbard at all. But he did point one thing out, which seemed mind-boggling to me. He said, when Art Ceppos came along and said, oh, okay, I'll commission you to write this book, Hubbard turned to me and he said, deep trance hypnosis isn't very popular. We're going to have to find another method. There was no research. He went from having hypnotized people, and there are letters where he talks about this.
Yes.
There's the famous 1949 letter to his agent, Forry Ackerman, which Tony has published. I've had all these letters for years. I didn't realize how desperately people needed to get them. I've got a huge collection of this kind of stuff. In this letter to Forry Ackerman, written from Savannah, Georgia, Hubbard says he's found a way of raping women, and they will not know that they've been raped. He doesn't talk about helping anybody. And then he decides he'll use the reverie or light trance method, and you get Dianetics. No research, no 270 clears, no anything. When I talked with Mike Rinder the other week, he was, the introspection rundown was researched on Bruce Welch. That's I'm going, but medical research is 1,000 cases, the gold standard.
Clinical trials. Good points. Excellent points. Mike Rinder and I go back 45 years. And I was right there when he talked about, I was telling Jeffrey, I'm going to dream about that stoning of the ship. I was right there as Mike explained. And I'd like to just add to this great podcast you did with Mike Rinder. He's a dear close friend of mine. He's the first person I call on. Mike, it's me. He actually played a big part in transitioning me out of it all. He was talking to me back channels, and I had an OSA intelligence guy show up at my door and said, Karen, you're talking to Mike Rinder. This is irrevocable. If you don't immediately cease, you will be declared suppressive person. And I balked at him. How do you know? Are you stealing phone records? How do you know? Mike Rinder is in Florida, the other end. How do you know? And he was evasive, and he said, we have PIs. And they knew that privately I was talking to Mike Rinder towards the last few weeks of me being in the cult. They knew it because they do buy phone records. Now, of course, we talk on WhatsApp and other modalities. There's no phone record. You talk on, there's many ways to talk without any phone record, which is, I want to tell you just a little more. Oh, that smelly men's dorm reminded me. I was considered elite as a class 12. So I was in a woman's dorm of only 8. That was, instead of being with 22 smelly bodies, I was only with 8 because I was a class 12. 8
people. He said there was maybe 60 people.
Just a slither of a bunk bed. That was your space.
Yeah.
And when you ran down different stairways, sometimes odor would waft upward. And if you went anywhere near the men's dorm, the smell and the stink, and this sort of registered as, how can this be? How can this be the flagship Apollo?
The ideal scene.
Yeah. And it crawled with roaches. Mike didn't get into that. You would have something called roach derby.
Yeah.
And the roach derby meant everybody was commandeered to go find a roach. If you found a roach's nest of eggs, you got $1. But if you found only one roach, you got 50 cents. You literally could cash out. They were so desperate because every time supplies came aboard, the fruit, the vegetables, more roaches would come in from these Mediterranean. So we lived with roaches. Not only did we live with smells, we lived with roaches. I'm just telling you what the Apollo. Hubbard, of course, had cleaners that sanitized his quarters morning, noon, and night as messenger. So he lived in a ivory palace within the Apollo. But Tom, Dick, and Harry. So Bruce Welch. He actually, this is the young Mike Rinder. It was almost, as he explained, he was still a teenager.
18.
This was one of his first assignments. He had to stand outside Bruce Welch's cabin while Bruce screamed. He could practically rattle the nearby cabins with his roar of insanity. And Mike had to bodyguard outside 8 hours a day, listening to a madman.
From midnight to 8 a.m.
The young Mike Rinder, at 18 years old, doing this. Hubbard decided to be a pen pal. And although no one could talk to Bruce Welch, they would exchange little private notes and letters. And this became a huge case history, which we had to study every morning. At 8 o'clock, there was muster. Jeff Walker did the roll call. And then we had to study how Hubbard changed a lunatic into a sane man. And it started off with these little Bruce would write back, and then Hubbard would write back to Bruce, and then Hubbard, and this was all shoved under, no personal contact, shoved under the door. And Hubbard's first question was, just before you decided to kill me, what happened in your mind? So Bruce Welch was the case history that then started L11, which basically L11's key question is, what evil purpose do you have? This is all a migration of, but I will tell you, John, when you're on the high seas, having someone with an intent to kill is scary because you can't throw them in the ocean if you have any humanitarian kindness in your heart. So you're on a confined space with a killer roaming around. I think he grabbed a machete from the galley. Mike didn't mention that. Before they locked him down in this cabin, but he was he wasn't just a silent madman. He was a roaring, want to kill madman. And we were electrified every morning to study what Hubbard and Bruce Welch, it was like talk about an ongoing, this was an electrifying real life psycho TV show right on the Apollo. Yeah. And Mike Rinder was right there bodyguarding Bruce and listening to his roaring screams 8 hours a day. And we studied every inch of it. Now, when you're on the high seas, I can understand incarceration and lockdown was needed. But to make this a selling rundown, when you're grounded on the base, what is the need for lockdown? You're not on a ship, you're not on the high seas. There's no dangerous killer roaming around. So they transported what was done in one emergency situation on a ship and then made this a repeated rundown till the Lisa McPherson debacle. I mean, even to this day, did Jeffrey tell you there are 4 contracts you have to sign before getting any service in the Sea Hawk? There are 4 contracts. It now becomes like 2 inches thick of papers you have to sign in there before they'll even audit you. And one of them is you give them permission to do the introspection rundown on you. You give them complete and utter that if you have a mental breakdown, you're going to do what they say. You're going to. I don't have all the wording, but I know you're going to be interviewing Jeff again. You need to explore these 4 contracts. They get off the hook because you sign that your mental health will be completely, utterly in their ability to rule the waves. Anyway, that was a very good interview. Thank you for getting Mike Rinder to really tell you. And you see, Bruce Welch, he took a little bits and pieces and made it L11. So all these people that rushed to L11, this came from handling a madman. L11's roots and ancestor is simply the Bruce Welch coupled together. What have you done? What have you withheld? What evil purpose? This is L11. It's the story of a madman culled, and you now pay something like $20,000. But you're not the madman, and you don't have an urge to kill L. Ron Hubbard. But that's L11.
And as far as we know, Bruce Welch was offloaded as fast as possible, and we have no idea about his mental health. My presumption, having had to deal with people who have had psychotic episodes as a consequence, particularly of OT3, I was called in by the mental health asylum that is closest to St. Hill in Sussex. And I was astonished. This was many years ago in the early 1990s. I was astonished. 14 people turned up to hear me talk. Now, I know these people work crazy hours, very long hours. Why on earth would 14 of them care enough, doctors, nurses, to try and understand what was happening? Well, it was because every year they had 2 or 3 people coming from St. Hill who had gone completely crazy. They just had a guy who had basically ripped his clothes off, tried to attack everybody, smeared his excrement all over the walls, and they just had to leave him there. And these people, you know, these terrible psychs, these awful, evil people who are trying to destroy L. Ron Hubbard and the universe and all life, they really wanted to know how they could help these people, what they could do. And it, you know, so one of the things that I learned from them, because there were a number of times when, you know, people were sent to me by psychiatrists because they didn't know what to do with them. But one of the things I learned from them is that psychosis is cyclical.
Yes.
It isn't, you're always in this position. So what happened to Bruce Welch was that the episode went, but I'm pretty sure that it will have come back. It may not have been Hubbard he wanted to kill then, it may have been someone else. It may not have been Hubbard in the first place. And what we see with Hubbard, there's a guy called Althea Hart. He's mentioned still, I think, in Scientology 8.80. I think those are the numbers. And there's an acknowledgement to him at the beginning of the book. There certainly used to be. Althea Hart was the editor to Hubbard's books in 1954. He left and he started a network. You know, I'm not the original gangster. I'm not the Godfather. This was happening 30 years before I left. You know, it goes right the way back. Hart left and he started a magazine called The Aboree, which is all online. You can find it. It's hilariously funny. Almost everybody who was significant in the tens of movements that came out of Scientology and Dianetics, people like A.E. Van Vogt, for example, the great science fiction writer, who gave up writing and for the rest of his life, the next 30-something years, practiced Dianetics. Thought Scientology was complete nonsense. So I corresponded with him. But he and Don Purcell, who owned all the rights to Dianetics because he saved Hubbard from bankruptcy, these people would all contribute. So you have this ongoing history. But there's an article in one of them where Althea Hart says Hubbard should actually every 6 months when he discovers the secret of the universe, he should say, this is it, but put the date on it. So this is it, April 1957, this is it. And Bruce Welch is yet another of these examples of, you know, he says in Technical Degrades, that dreadful policy letter, everything I've said is true. You can't change any of it. It doesn't matter whether it was the most recent or an older statement. Whatever I say, that's the tech. And of course you start going, but there are complete contradictions here. You know, even in simple things, you never call a floating needle if it's outside the 2 to 3.5 range on the tone arm. And there's another bulletin that says some idiot has said, yeah, it was you, Ron. You're the idiot who said you don't do this. And that's the case so often that you become locked. You can't think. You've got contradictory information. So coming from Hubbard, and you can't really think with it, tend to do what you're told. Behind that is his inability to ever be wrong. Is, so that he's completely changed his mind about something, but because he researched LSD years after they've come off LSD, on research into 2 cases I have found. One of those 2 cases was Harvey Haber. And Harvey told me about this, and he said, what happened was I annoyed Hubbard, and this woman had annoyed Hubbard. And so he had our folders gone through, and you know what a folder error summary can be like, tens and tens of hours of work. And the only thing in common was that we'd both taken LSD. That was the research that said that all people who've taken LSD are stupid, psychotic, can't be. Then you find out that Hubbard himself took LSD.
Oh.
He told David Mayo this out of session. He said, I took that. I got a letter from a guy whose guru had taken LSD with Hubbard in the 50s, and that everything, you're into this. I originally, one of the titles for Blue Sky was Hubbard Through the Looking Glass, because it seemed to me that everything is the opposite of what it appears to be. Scientology claims to be a religion. It's actually an intelligence agency. It claims to be liberating mankind from implants. It's actually implanting people with behaviors and ideas and making them more fervent, making them more fanatical, to the point, the case you mentioned, I'm not going to mention the guy's name, and I don't know if he's still alive, but I was giving a talk and this guy arrived, and he was in a wheelchair, and his flesh kind of overlapped the wheelchair. He was he was morbidly obese, and he started talking about being in the Sea Org aboard the ship, and he said that I'd got everything about Hubbard and Scientology right, except the tech works. That's the bit I'd got wrong. And I looked at him, he could barely move. His wife had brought him along. She wasn't in Scientology because some of his old friends were going to be talking, and she thought it might cheer him up because he was horribly depressed. He then told me that one of our mutual friends, Otto Rose, who I knew very well in the 1990s, and was very helpful, gave me a tremendous amount of information, very thorough, very precise. But he started to lose his sight. And this guy was saying that he was devising a process that would give Otto his sight back. And kind of going, exactly, I said to him exactly what you said. Look in the mirror. It doesn't work. There is no Scientologist has passed the level of communication release, which is a very low level. They can't communicate freely with anyone on any subject because they can't talk about their case. They can't use verbal tech. They can't describe Scientology, and they can't talk to this huge list of people that they're free to communicate with anyone on any subject. Then you get to clear an operating Thetan. If there was a single operating Thetan, they wouldn't have needed the Guardian's office. They could have seen what was in those files. They wouldn't need to fight somebody like you or me. They could just silence us using their superpowers. It's not true. It doesn't work. And yet, as you say, it will be, but haven't you had wins? It's like, I felt happy going to the fair. I felt happy in the cinema. These are not, it's not because of the process of cinema, then I now have to worship cinema, that I thought that, Apocalypse Now was a good film. It kind of makes this thing dependent upon the guru, the God figure, the bringer of wisdom. And in Hubbard's case, you're dealing with an incredibly tortured soul. You're dealing with a very unhappy man who was ill pretty much all of the time. He talks about terror stomach in the 50s and his ulcers, which was his actual war wound. We didn't find anything else in looking through the records. So he did say he fell down a ship's ladder at one point. He even admits this. There's I think it's 23rd September 1950, Introduction to Dianetics, a lecture which David Miscavige has now issued, where he tells the truth about failing his course in atomic and molecular physics. And yet later on, he becomes a nuclear physicist. He tells the truth about having something wrong with his feet, and that was about the limit of his war wounds. But he had ulcers. He was an alcoholic. We now are in the situation where there are some people who were with him who really want to believe. And you can only start thinking, do they have Stockholm syndrome? Did they really not see him screaming his head off at people, giving them severe reality adjustments? Because I've interviewed quite a lot of people. Did they really think that overboarding would not be traumatic? This man who'd come to cure trauma is throwing people overboard.
For a minor error, not some hideous crime, but throwing overboard anyway.
Yeah. Punishing people, hurting people to release them from engrams. And putting a child in the chain locker. That was the one that stopped me.
The viciousness of Scientology is something hard to swallow, because it's an entity of vengeance. Vengeance. Every SB clan cutting you off from everybody else and the punishments they give, it's retaliation and vengeance. A religion, John, I know you'll agree with me, should have kindness, compassion, love, harmony, engagement in the oneness of our higher selves. It should bring out you should become a better human being because you belong to this entity. Then the religion has done its job. You're a better human being because I'm a da-da-da. In Scientology, the vengeance and hate. I was in 40 years, and I never ever thought of speaking out, ever. I vented a little under an anonymous name called War and Peace. I vented some, but I was going to I lead a very full life. I do animal rescue, which is a huge part of my life. And I'm plugged into all, I have lives with my art dealing totally outside the cult. I lead a full life. I didn't need to be this, but they immediately, in vengeance, because I was talking to Mike Rinder and Marty Rathburn, cut me off from my one child, Alexander Chench. And they shipped him off to Dallas, Fort Worth, so he would be far away from me. And they completely cut the line, saying, she's a suppressive person. But before he left for Dallas, they got my son to call me. And he said, Mom, I want you to go to this page. It was a hate page that the cult had set up on me. They got my son to visit a hate page and call me up and say, can you look at John, I had a boob job. I felt dowdy when I came out of the Sea Org. I had a little bit of, who cares? Who cares about somebody? It's a boyfriend-girlfriend thing. I had a boob job. The only people that knew was my auditor, because at the time I was a true believer and you have anesthesia, it was surgery, so I ran Dianetics, so only the cult knew. It's not something you broadcast. Who needs to know about somebody else's boob job? So they did a hate page. Ha ha ha, Karen de la Carriere had a boob job, blah, blah, blah. And they got my son to take me to this hate page and say, Mom, you had a boob job? They got my son to say this on the phone to me. Then they bundled him off to Dallas Fort Worth. Long story short, he died at 27 years old. He had no mom because he had been told he grew up in the cult and nobody talks to an SP. And I was the suppressive person. And his father, Heber Jensch, president of Church of Scientology International, was in lockdown for 8 years in that hell called SP hole, suppressive person hole. So he had no dad, no mom, he was orphaned. And when he got pneumonia, walking pneumonia, he took no antibiotics. John, a $20 antibiotic would have saved his life. $20. He had he had chest pains, which your lungs can give you with walking pneumonia. And he kept taking drugs. And he even took methadone or whatever. Anyway, he was dead. So I feel the cult of Scientology have blood on their hands.
Oh, great.
The reason that Alexander Jensch died at 27, can you imagine the loss? You've got two beautiful boys. I mean, just three, because Sam was. Can you imagine the loss of your son? This is what the cult did. I call it a death cult. So busy were they having vengeance. She's speaking out, we're going to take away her son. And then they would rather he die than, I'm known to be affluent. I'm a pretty affluent person. I would have had a full medical done on him. He would have been on the right antibiotic within an hour. But they chose out of the vengeance which came from Hubbard and rolled down, because Hubbard was very much into retaliation. Every SP declare is a vengeance on you. You can walk in and out of the Methodist, Episcopalian, Catholic Church. They don't put out an issue on you saying you're an antisocial personality and you will never talk to your son again. That's the cult of Scientology. And after Alexander died, I started my YouTube channel and I have 11.5 million views in 7 years, which means more than 1 million people a year listen to my voice on YouTube. They don't look when they're stupid and foolish and fling out a hate, vendetta. They don't dream for a moment of what the consequences can be. They're trying to appease and placate David Miscavige. So they think in the moment, and by God, I come back and expose. I didn't dream how successful I would ever be. So John, my respect for someone like you is beyond what I can say, because you're on the road to truth and it's in your DNA to expose lies. I've been, when I listen to you, when I follow, when I see your urge to just unveil and uncover falsehoods, fakeness, the prison of belief because of swallowing the hogwash. And therefore I salute you.
Thank you. The feeling is mutual. And it is that Hubbard in 1968, a journalist called Charlie Nairn, who'd already made one film about Scientology, was tasked by Granada TV to go and interview Ron Hubbard. And it took him a while to find him, but he got there and he made a documentary, which is the best documentary that will ever be made about Scientology. And I've worked on a few, called The Shrinking World of L. Ron Hubbard.
I believe I've seen it. It's
on YouTube. It's 20 minutes long. It's the only hostile interview of Ron Hubbard. And he comes apart. He had a first wife and a third wife. I had no second wife. He named two wives. He says, there are no Swiss bank. Oh, there's one Swiss bank account. Yeah. When asked, does he believe in reincarnation? He pauses. So Charlie says, but your followers believe. And he goes, oh, yes, they believe. And you sort of get the man. But what Charlie said was that for 2 hours before the camera went on, from about 1 or 2 in the morning, he and Hubbard talked. And he said to Hubbard, it's a scam, isn't it? And Hubbard went, yeah, of course it is. Don't be ridiculous. And he said, Charlie he was about 25 at the time, lovely guy. And he said, it must be so hard for you having to keep the pretense up all the time. And Hubbard was, yeah, poor me, you know. And so Charlie Nairn said to him, why do you do it? And this is where the revenge thing comes in. The first part, he said, it's nice being able to tell your wife you've made $10,000 today. This is 1968. So that's more like $1 million. You know, it's certainly hundreds of thousands now every day. That's nice. But he said, the real reason is I like to catch the clever ones and reel them in. And for me, that's a 10-year-old boy saying, nobody loves me. I'm going to get my own back on you. And that's what Scientology is. It's Ron Hubbard's revenge on the world. You know, last year I published a chapter with Steve Hassan. No, actually, it hasn't been published yet. It's coming out in the Oxford University Press. And we looked at Elliot Rodger, the Isla Vista killings in Santa Barbara, who was this young man who was an involuntary celibate, an incel, who railed because women wouldn't go out with him. And he's saying, look, I'm good looking. I've got money. I've got this fancy new BMW. Why won't? And he's put out these videos, and then he went and killed people. He killed 6 women and 3 men. And in his departing video, he said that he was going to show women the world over that they shouldn't have rejected him. And that felt so much like the little boy Hubbard, that kind of immature idea of, I'm going to show you all, I'm going to teach you all. And Hubbard kind of did, because he left $648 million that he had extracted vampirically from his followers, who in return got what? The feeling of euphoria, the sense that they were special, the belief that they were superior to the rest of humanity. What else did they actually get? You know, they didn't have any special powers. They couldn't resist disease and illness. They didn't have perfect memory or emotional equanimity or any of the things he'd promised. He got his revenge. He showed people what fools they were. And from what I hear about OT8, this kind of explains that the whole thing was, well, now you've got to undo everything that you did. And that'll be...
we got to do a show just on OT8. I have so much data. It would be a Saturday Night Live special. That means we would get so much laughter. You know, this is all so dark, so hateful. So we can lighten it up. I got to do a show on OT8 with you. But you know, one thing I do want to tell you is I loved that you connected so well with David Mayo. He was my dearest hero. I just absolutely, I got comment because of I tried to stay loyal to David Mayo after he was declared. And I got a committee of evidence just saying, she thinks David Mayo is a great man. My track with David on the ship, and what a man of honor. If there's one word, with you, I go into the word, if I could label, it's truth. Truth versus lies. With David, I think honor and integrity was most important to him. We have so many mutual friends. Ira Chalif was the commanding officer of AOSH UK when I was this young intern at St. Hill. And I've known Ira through Jay Hurwitz. He's a friend. He fled in base when those 12 were all sent to the running program.
Yeah.
He fled.
Yeah.
He fled with Alan Buchanan and all the others. Is Jay alive and well? Is Jay chugging along?
I've been in touch with Jay for years.
You didn't answer, but you kept me in suspense. Did he testify?
He did, yeah.
He did. Whoa!
The case was won. But yeah, I mean, Ira, I've stayed in touch with. I've known him for 3 years now, I think it is. And
Yeah.
he actually worked for me briefly when he was on a leave of absence with the SEALs.
ah,
So
ah,
the point where he went to the US and
yeah,
in 82 and was declared suppressive, I
yeah.
was called in by Peter Shantz, who you probably also know.
Yes, I know British ones.
Peter called me in St. Hill and said, you've got to come in. And I wasn't the sort of person who felt compelled to go to events or anything like that. So somebody was insisting I do something. I didn't necessarily do it, but Peter was so insistent. So I went in and he said, there's a rumor that IRA is going to be declared. What are we going to do about this? And I said, well, of course, we'll fight it. It's a ridiculous idea. The idea that Ira Chaloff is suppressive, forget it. He's a wonderful guy. And a week later, I got a phone call from Peter Shantz saying I'd got to come in again. So I went in and he said, he's been declared. And I said, what are we going to do about it? And he said, these people, they can be so devious or something like that. I'm sort of, well, where's the declare? What's he done? He said, oh, there isn't one. I'm sort of, so there's no Court of Ethics, Committee of Evidence, no Bill of Particulars. This is illegal. This is off policy. And he's like, no. So how do you know he's declared? I've got a list of 600 names.
600.
Again, that's your idea of Scientology. My idea of Scientology was you follow the policy that says this has got to happen. And that was actually the next 6 months. I've not really talked about this because Ira was, because he was working, with congressmen and things like this from the 1980s. It was a bit of a difficult situation. But he has now gone public. I wrote a book 5 years ago, and he said he contacted one of his friends who he knew would disconnect from him because he said, look, I'm supporting John Atack, and he's, so that's the way it will be. But he has spoken out. He's had an incredible career. He is one of the most important thinkers of our time, with courageous followership and intelligent disobedience. And you have to say, he learned this in the negative. He learned by being around Hubbard. The only time I've ever seen a severe reality adjustment, because I wasn't in the SEAL, was Ira did it to my wife, my first wife. She hadn't sold any paintings that week. I'm an artist. That's my real life. And she hadn't sold. So he got her in a tiny little room, stood 2 inches away from her and screamed at her. And I hovered outside the door. I'd never heard anything like this before. And the next time I saw him, about 3 days later, sat him down and said, what were you doing? Where's the policy on doing that? And he said, there is no policy. And I said, if it isn't written, it isn't true, because that's what you said. And I said, who told you to do this? And he put his head in his hands and he started crying. He said, Hubbard did it to us. And that was a major shift. I was still a Scientologist. I'd done OT5 and all of that. I wasn't very happy with Scientology and the way it was going, but I still really believed it was the way, the truth, the life. It was the only thing that was going to save mankind. And here I'm being told that the man who created this system is a raving lunatic. For me, anybody that cannot control their temper, that's not a Buddha figure for me. That's not a guru figure for me. Somebody who feels they have to burn people to the ground with their rage. Imagine how many people are there out there still traumatized. I met a guy who'd been 20 years housebound, 20 years without leaving the house, because Hubbard had told him he was a suppressive person and he didn't want to hurt anyone. Wow. It took one afternoon to get him out and about again, largely, in fact, because of his wife's incredible endurance and patience. But he sat down, he read, Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, and talked with me for a couple of hours, went back home, got a job, and it was over. But the effect that just one conversation with Ron Hubbard had on him.
Nice anecdote. My suppressive person declared is a lot of fluff and froth of nothing. But what was highly amusing is a charge in my SB declare was that I yelled and I screamed and I interpolated with this screaming. And I thought to myself, you were not on the ship with Hubbard. You say I screamed? Hubbard would shake the Apollo with his temper tantrum rages, which would, even to Mary Sue, his own wife, he was completely out of control with his temper tantrums.
Yeah.
That, to name me as someone who now and again yelled when Hubbard was the poster boy for yelling, screaming, throwing temper tantrums and losing it.
And it supports this idea that he never grew up. He was a child. He never matured, and he had, you know, I saw it so many times. What happens in Scientology is somebody, they do a process, they feel fantastic, they feel really high, they write a success story, they go and borrow some more money, and 3 days later, and it's usually 3 days later, they don't feel so good.
Yeah.
Now they're a potential trouble source. What an interesting phrase that is.
Yeah, the label comes on quickly.
To Ron Hubbard.
Yeah. Lost your gains, your PTS.
Mm-hmm. And post-traumatic stress, of course, accidentally picked up the same initialization, PTSness, which is what you will get in Scientology, that's for sure. Then, of course, you have to go and get the next dose to get the feeling back. And it excludes everything else. When I interviewed people who were doing transcendental meditation, it's about 1991, I was asked to write a book, which I decided not to write. I was shocked when I found out there were people who were meditating 12 hours a day. Their children were running wild. They'd lost their job, but they'd become so obsessed with this feeling that they were getting, this high they were getting. It had become more important to them than their own children.
Yeah.
Which I personally cannot understand.
That's what we covered earlier. It's like a heroin fix or something. They want that high. A human being wants a high, whether it's $1 million win at a casino or a drug like LSD or whatever. To get that high, they will go through pain, suffering, horror. Look at these people, the slaves in the Sea Org. They just stay on year in and year out with devastated lives because they believe, I got that high and I can get it again. Things will change, blah, 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 blah. John, listen, it's been just enchanting having some time. We can, I hope you will invite, I've got things to tell you. I really have got things to tell you, but let's not, I think that when it's a little shorter than too long, we get more audience. I've learned this very well with my channel. And we've talked a while. It's been just really great to hang with you. John, talk to me soon, huh?
Yeah, let's do this again soon. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much.
Really, really, it was fun. It was fun. Bye-bye. Bye, John.
Thanks a lot.
Love to you and a big hug. What do you call it? Virtual hug. Virtual hug.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. I've been John Atack and my guest Karen de la Carriere. Thank you.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.